Joseph Earl Thomas. Welcome to Wild Precious Life.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, I've had the chance to read both your debut memoir, Sink, and your debut novel, God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, but not everyone who's listening is going to have had that same opportunity. So, will you just begin by telling us some of your story?
Definitely. Sometimes I forget that those are debut books because they are, like many people, those aren't the first things that I had ever written. And I'm like scrolling back through the Rolodex now and revising stuff these days. A lot of it is in Sync. So Sync is a memoir written primarily in third person, some in second person. It's about kind of coming of age ish between the ages of 8 and 13. And it's primarily about how you learn to be a person in the world without a clear set of directions or following a script. And what that primarily looks like, especially if you don't have a lot of kind of external resources. And then God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer is a novel in first person, kind of playing with these versions of self, of course, but it's set over the course of a single day in an emergency department where people come in and out of the protagonist's life who are both just patients from the community, but also turn out to be like folks that he knows in real life. And part of that journey is also about trying to get to know the protagonist's estranged father, who is involved in the Holmesburg prison experiments, which were a real thing that ended far later than I think sometimes we remember, but that in the book are kind of alive and well, even though it's set in kind of present day.
Yeah, thank you for both. And I want to talk about both of those books, but I got distracted when you said they weren't the first ones. What you
Mhm.
got hanging out in the drawer? Give us like a preview of something that you thought was good, and then you look back and you're like, oh no. Or you
Oh
still think
yeah.
is good, and you're like, I am gonna get my young adult vampire retelling of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It will find the light of day. What's in a drawer
Yeah.
somewhere?
I find it hilarious that you said that because I am not at all opposed to writing the young adult retelling of A Midsummer Night's Dream. To be clear, I was talking to a friend the other day about my, long-awaited vampire novel that I absolutely will write, a la, Colson Whitehead's kind of zombie novel kind of thing, right? I'm really interested in that. Or like Jewel Gomez's vampire novel, The Gilda Stories. So that is a real thing that will at some point happen. I There's so many short stories, some of which are going to be in a collection that is set to come out in August called Leviathan Beach. Um, Lots and lots of poems that at the time I thought, wow, this is great. Some of which I have revised, and I'm like, oh, okay, this isn't bad. Some of which have come to see the light of day. But recently, what I've actually been working on are essays because I was so afraid of essays, but they feel and felt so necessary to me. So I'd written like dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of essays. I used to do a little blog back in the day, thinking I was cute when that was a thing that one would do. But I think it was good practice. And a lot of them are so horrible, but nowadays I'm trying to challenge myself by doing the thing that I think is the hardest and writing some of those essays that on one end are not newly obsessed with current events, let's say. So less the kind of like op-ed, I just discovered this thing was bad today style, and are not necessarily completely trying to make, my friends happy, a la what is the kind of how do I toe the party line as best as possible kind of thing. So that's what I'm thinking about a lot these days.
All right. I could go with a mashup of A Midsummer Night's Dream vampire essay. I'm just putting it, I'm saying if you're
Yeah,
looking
yeah.
for ideas. I like what you said about the blogging. Roxane Gay pretty famously talked about that. Like in her early substacking was just like I miss the the rigor. And I mean everyone who was aspiring to be a writer in like maybe 2004. I don't know when we all had blogs, but like there was something ritualistic, and you sat down to do the thing and you had this built-in deadline and you had this it was almost like calisthenics. I look back at some of the things I wrote back then, and yes, some of them are tired and they hit the same themes, but
Hmm.
there was something really great about the exercise of it. The squats
Yes.
or the push-ups of what we were
Hmm.
doing
Hmm.
every day. We sat down, or whatever time of week we did that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I kind of really loved that, and I still kind of sit down and write all the time. It's not that I don't really feel pressure to share everything, by any stretch of the imagination, right? At this point, but it is nice as just kind of, and that's also the only actual exercise I do, which I think is good for my brain, right? Like the kind of half hour of like I do some calisthenics and I do some writing every morning, and sometimes it feels like it amounts to nothing, and other times I'm like I'm really glad I did that, and it's something, right? Something to continue.
Yeah, 100%. So, hey, let's start with your memoir, which I believe is 2023. You're just kind of doing a book a year here, man. I'm impressed by your
We'll see how
your
we'll see how long that works out.
swiftness. Okay, so if this was a novel, if you had told me, hey, these are the scenes I'm thinking of putting in this book. The main character Joey, he's going to be assaulted at school and verbally and physically abused at home. He's going to engage in some questionable sexual activities and adopt a series of pets, which are all going to disappear or die. His mom's going to be an addict and she doesn't come around much. His grandpa's going to beat the shit out of him all the time. And then he's going to be hungry and teased and bullied and also accused of being gay. And he's sometimes suicidal and often alone. Like, if you had come to me and said, this is a book I'm thinking of writing, I would have said, man, that's too much, right? He's a single character. You got to back off. Just like tone it down. Like, give that guy a break. But that it's real life, right? So there was no toning down, or maybe this is the toned down version. I don't know. I think my question is
Yeah.
like, what the heck, man? Or how did you make it through? I don't know. Tell me about this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's two things. Like, so I love that tone was one of the points in it. And this is something that I was thinking about a lot, right? There's no shortage of narratives, let's say, both in literature or on the screen, et cetera, that where bad things happen, right? That's in general, there's not a shortage of them. I think that what distinguishes them for me is primarily tone. So I was dedicated to not writing a romance or a triumphal kind of narrative thing. I did not. That's the last thing I would ever do. And I also didn't want it to be, and I don't, and by that I mean I didn't want it to use the language of romance or triumph, right? There was, the kind of superfluousness that you could see in really kind of early stage creative writing that gets shorthanded as like, oh, why are there 500 adjectives attached to this one particular action? Or, et cetera, et cetera. So I was much more interested in the quotidian, right? So some of the rules I had for myself were like, if something didn't happen more than once or regularly, I would not write about it, right? So there aren't, to my mind, a set of like phenomenal events occurring, right? And then the other thing was kind of like, all right, well, if this was in some way a kind of life that most of the people I knew were living that was not abnormal to like my own parents or my grandparents, et cetera, even when they were children, because that was part of this process too, was saying like, oh, mom, grandma, grandfather, like tell me about your childhood or something. And they were kind of like eerily similar, right? So to that end, I was like, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't some thing about being a kind of prophesizable individual or something like that. Uh, and to my mind, that makes it feel more real, no matter how the thing itself is ultimately structured or what kind of perspective it comes from, right? And that made it a lot of it writable for me. It made it possible to have some to be serious about how deeply fucked up and also how deeply humorous things were often at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard you say elsewhere that to be working class and black in Philly at the time that you were working class and black in Philly meant that everybody you knew was either getting beat or doing the beating, and often both. That this wasn't even so much just your story, but just the story, right? And it's interesting that you mentioned it's intergenerational, that folks were either perpetrating what I'm going to call violence or having violence perpetrated against them, or both. And that the whole time when I'm reading just your story, I'm reading a story that I'm understanding to be deeply familiar to a whole bunch of people, not
Mhm.
just you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I mean, it's funny, we had like one or two white folks in my neighborhood for whom that was also the norm, for whom that was also the norm. And there was nothing, it was interesting, right? I think one of the main divining lines, I think we're not always that good at being specific about these things, right? So it's, it was true that in my own background, we understood, right? For example, like white supremacy as like a kind of obvious historical circumstance instead of logics for why things were the way they are. Why, like our landlord was this white guy who did not work as hard as, for example, my grandfather. Those things were like a little on the obvious side. And at the same time, we were not that interested in like worshiping what white people had. And I think sometimes folks forget that unless you like write a dissertation about it in the middle of the book or something. And whereas to us it was kind of obvious, like but it's also true that stuff just wasn't interesting, that degree of obsession on that end wasn't interesting. And at the same time, we were speaking almost always to each other. So we weren't that invested in like we can't say or do X because like those white folks over there who were never going to like be nice to us, who were never going to give us jobs, who were never going to do whatever anyway, what they were saying or thinking, right? It was more like what is it that's going on between these like 15, 20 people in this several blocks radius, which was the limit of the sphere at that age. And so I was really working to try and show that condensation and that kind of claustrophobia that comes with that feeling.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was not always a fun book to read. That wasn't the F word that came up for me when I read Sink. Um, but man, there is something so incredibly compelling about going through it with somebody. Like you feel, I don't know. I think it was in your other book. You talk about like trauma is. I actually wrote it down because I wanted to make sure I remembered it. This idea of like maybe the only thing we all have in common is trauma. That I look at, I don't know, like the recognition, I guess was the word you used. I've started to think that the only recognition in life is trauma. Um, and there's something that forms like kinship. Like the hurting inside of me is different than the hurting inside of you, but it's also the same. Like the shit that I went through and the shit that you went through, not the same. But there's some kinship that forms, I think, when someone lays out their trauma and then gives a reader permission to quit hiding their own, maybe?
Yeah, yeah, there's something about it's a double-edged kind of thing, right, too, because on the one hand we have the kind of colloquialism trauma bonding, right? This sense that we feel closer to someone based on the acknowledgement that something bad has happened to both of us, like whatever that thing is, right? Which is just like part of being alive, like when you're born, being born is a painful experience, right? Like that kind of changing your circumstances is like really painful. And a lot of times, yeah, there's many things. It's just like pile upon pile of bad or difficult things that happen to any given person, and so like that can kind of mislead us sometimes to feeling like we know or can feel the same or like another person. And on the other hand, the books or the kinds of art that have made me feel less lonely in the world are those moments when somebody actually admits, not only are the things that happen to me or you fucked up, but like, isn't it fucked up that our recourse to those things is mostly forms of repetition that seem to not be making things better? Like, if we're really going to kind of go there, right? Like, that is for me what really difficult literature, let's say, for example, uh, really difficult art kind of does for me. And it doesn't, without, right, being uh, again, creating the romance thing or being like, now everything is healed because we like know or whatever. But I think it's a good starting place to just be straightforward and say, hey, things have been very difficult for for a lot of us, and we should at the very least be able to situate ourselves in those details without constantly replacing them with kind of like feel good metonyms or something like that that actually make me feel less lonely. I mean, more lonely. I'm sorry. Like the feel good metonyms make me feel more lonely than saying like, hey, here's our starting point.
Yeah, I hear that. We've had a handful of authors to the show. I'm thinking of Lisa Nicolodakis, whose memoir "No One Crosses the Wolf" is this staggering description of like her inheriting the crime scene of her extended family. We've had Ashley C. Ford on, and her memoir was similarly full of abuse and neglect. And one of the things I asked them, and I guess which I'll ask you, is like now the book's just out there, just out
Hmm.
there, and how do you talk about it without it hurting you anymore? Or I guess maybe, do you talk about the book without the whole conversation being re-traumatizing?
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like based on what I've heard people say, I think one difference has been that I'm not from a position where that stuff was hidden so much. So there's only, I feel like so many times that the thing can be repeated. Like, for example, I wasn't interested in writing anything that was a secret to anyone. Was the first and kind of most important rule, right? I would never write something about someone or replay a conversation that I was not willing to have with them, not just once or twice, but kind of regularly. So I had kind of already gone over these things so much, right? Or they were already quotidian, they were already so everyday that these were not things that felt hurtful to me anymore in the same way that they would have when I was an 8-year old. And consider my and felt, even though I kind of inherently knew, right, and maybe felt at that time that I was like the only person in the world who has ever suffered. What is it? I think it's like one of the Baldwin things is like you think you're the only person in the world who has suffered, and then you read a book or whatever, right? Like I think a lot as a child, it's perfectly reasonable to feel that, right? But I think part of learning and being like a kind of grown and more mature person is one to do away with the idea of your own innocence, as well as the idea that you are the only person in the world who has like suffered profoundly or something like that. And I think what helped me through those things was that I maintained an intimacy with my own family in which there weren't a lot of things that were hidden or not talked about, right? Things were direct, even when we didn't really like it. Which, and I didn't, it's funny, this I think is in part a class thing. I didn't realize that people hid all of those things that I thought were important until, say, for example, I went to college and people would not talk directly about things that they had done or had happened to them. And it was all a secret. Or about money, for example. And I thought, I don't know if this is healthy for anyone that all of these things are somehow secret now. And I wanted to like be serious about undoing that in my own aesthetics.
So I've spoken with other memoirists, and I'm not trying to call you a memoirist as though you don't write other things, but
Yeah.
the approach sometimes is if you're writing about somebody else, that you're going to let them read it first, or that you're going to let them
Hmm.
know. So, for instance, one of the characters in your memoir is your mom,
Hmm.
right? Who, if I'm not mistaken, had you when she was like 14, right? She
Yeah.
was a really young mom. Someone who struggled with addiction throughout most of the story that I got to read. So, in the instance of your mom, did you did she read these passages before you put them out there? Like, what was your process like when you're going to put out there difficult subject matter that isn't a secret, but it wasn't known to the whole world?
Hmm. Hmm. I think, part of it is, of course, taking in what degree she's willing to explain, describe, or talk about these things openly with strangers, and the kind of basic asking. The other problem or thing that has always been difficult for me is that no one else in my family really reads. I know that this is like a general, which sounds like some like bad thing that you're not supposed to say, right? But most people in America don't
Nobody
read
reads.
or like can't read actually, and that is also importantly not their fault. So I think that sometimes you have to say the obvious thing in order to be. So obviously, right? Like it's not folks' fault. Most people don't read. It's getting worse. Um, and so like I was immediately like, this was part of my impetus for doing the audiobook myself and handing out audiobooks to everyone and being like, hey, can you listen? Right, just to make sure. The first person I ever had asked permission or to be clear about things with was my aunt, because I most certainly didn't want to make her look like a villain. Like, I understand the way that whenever a black person says, thinks, or does anything, culpability is like kind of automatic, right? Like the whole world is being like, how can I blame said person? And that in some ways there's like an unavoidability about that, but it doesn't mean that you should never say or do or think anything. So it's always caught in between that tension, right? But for me, in sharing things with people, it was mostly through audiobook, or basically like forcing people, like, let me read you this passage, or, because no one is interested in reading, like, it doesn't matter. And I think that this is also a kind of class relation thing too, because and I think it's related to like the not talking about money directly, not talking about sex directly, etc., because everyone of a certain position is most interested about what other people think about them, or what other people will think about them. And I think if you're part of a kind of non-working poor or underclass, those concerns are a little further out, right? You're like, how the fuck do I make sure I get food today? How do I make sure that the people I care about are going to survive until tomorrow? And these ideas about, oh, well, what if they don't like me? you know, or they feel trite, like, what if someone doesn't like me? What if some person thinks I am bad? That is like, whatever. Who cares? And I think I've both benefited in some ways with my own intellectual freedom, and also suffered uh, in the kind of like public spaces based on the fact that I often think that way still, even though I'm in the midst of kind of changing class positions, despite, working 500 jobs or whatever, so it's a weird space, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right about how we ascribe like individual consequences or responsibility to what are ultimately societal or big organizational, socioeconomic, political issues. Like the
Yeah.
fact that Pop Pop is angry a lot of time in the book is not an individual person with anger. This is a man who's working inside of a context for less than maybe he should have made otherwise, within a situation where he's raising children who aren't his own, right?
Right.
And doing so with whatever skill set was set for him from the men who came before him. Prison comes up a lot in the book because America likes nothing better than to put black men in prison for things that white men got away with. Like you cannot look at a character in your book and say, "Oh, he was like that," without looking at a much bigger picture.
Yeah, precisely. Precisely. It is exactly that thing. And despite that, right, and I know still, even with that, there will always be people who will say, isn't the mom a monster? Isn't the grandfather a monster? But for me, the most important thing is to be like, no, there are no heroes, especially not myself as character, under any circumstances would I ever write some shit like that. And also, these are primarily about decisions that were made long before any of us were born, and the difficulty of disentangling them, not just as ideas, but on the kind of ground level, right? It's one thing to say, like, yeah, like, this is a dude who is basically a perpetual laborer whose life is shit, who is like raising a bunch of kids that are not his. And he's also a fucking quintessential abuser, especially of the women and children. And, neither one of those things are like unimportant to any degree. And, for me, it's really, really important to try and keep those two things in tension all the time in any form of thing that I'm writing, and never to be like, and never to take the kind of easy route and be like, oh, isn't this person, so bad, or isn't this whatever? It's also true that I'm primarily talking about people who don't have a lot of power in general, right? I would be much less lenient, or let's say much less concerned about complication if, my grandfather was like the ruler of the free world or something, which, like, by virtue of the nation's history, is not even a figurable possibility, right? It's not even a figurable possibility for me to be that, no matter how many jobs I've worked, or things I published or whatever the case may be. And that is what I'm interested in, right? Like those kinds of, it's more likely that I will end up in prison even from this date in my life than I would ever be like a president or something. And I think that it's important to kind of keep that stuff in mind.
Yeah. Also, I think that in addition to not reading, a lot of folks have a hard time holding multiple truths at the same
Hmm.
time. We spoke with Melissa Phoebus about her upcoming book and just this idea that like it's and both, right? My own mother is notoriously mean, right? She just is, and she would tell you she's mean, and she's just nasty, right? She stole money from my kid's preschool, right? That makes her sound like a
Right.
monster,
Right.
right? Most moms don't steal money from your purse. They
But
just
it's not
don't.
as if she will be the first and last person to ever do so.
Exactly. And it's also not as though that's the only part of her character. And so what I like about the way you portray people, both in your memoir and in your debut novel, is that everyone is complicated. Everyone is this and also that, and also terrible, and also beautiful. Because if we really look at the relationships in our lives, that's how they are, and that's how we are. And it's good to just be honest about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so hard though. It is very difficult. Like this is a kind of foundational, in part because like the broader kind of structural concerns, they just fucking get worse, you know? Like this person just became president again, right? Like we're, so headlong into a kind of quite obvious genocide that we are not even allowed to talk about, so I understand why people would be like, um, I will just forget it and say I'm gonna just make everybody who's been treated bad a hero. Like I understand the urge to do that. I don't think it's a long-term solution though, and I think that it's better if we try and keep these things in tension, right? And try to recognize, like the difference between power and identity, the difference between kind of splashing a blank slate of like goodness or evil upon particular acts or something like that.
Yeah, I hear that. Okay, so in addition to writing a debut memoir one year, you also had a debut novel come out what felt like 30 seconds after the initial one. God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer is, among other things, a series of stories of a guy in the ER. He's a nurse in a trauma unit in the ER in a Philadelphia hospital. And the place is hopping, right? There are gunshot victims. There's older folks with chronic illnesses. This guy's family members keep showing up. There's pregnant women. In addition, like similarly to the memoir, this main character, whose name is Joe, can't catch a break, like literally, like can't grab time to eat some food. What's Tell us about this book? Like, why a Philly hospital? Why a nurse in a trauma setting? What's your nickel in that quarter?
Yeah, I mean, good questions. I think it's not unrelated, naturally, right, to some of the earlier questions. And for me, part of the problem is, and I think that this is twofold, right? It's like, how do you deal with difficulty in your kind of everyday life when, there's no set of institutions that can absolve you or save you from like a certain kind of like wreckage that is, hundreds, thousands of years old. And um, the other part of it, which is like, it's not like we have leisure time. Like, I don't really know anyone who has leisure. And I was thinking about this in my real life. Who do I know that gets up every day and has a large swath of time carved out for whatever it is they would like to do? That is no one. And one of the things that I noticed about literature, and this was, before, as a child, one of my aversions to literature was that leisure time seemed to be a given, right? Like the idea that a main character would have something like this thing that we call leisure time. They'd be out and about playing. What do they call it? Like getting into trouble, let's say, right? Like, especially in these like kind of coming of age novels with like young adults. I'm like, I could not imagine, even being 18, 19, 20, 21, and not working 2 or 3 jobs or being at work. I don't know anyone personally. I'm not close to anyone who has lived that kind of life. So, and by job, I mean whatever kind of job that might have been, right? And I mean like paying taxes. So I was obsessed with what it means to try and carve a space for thinking when you have to do that, when you do have to work all the time. How does one do that? How do you build social relationships? How do you think about conflict and conflict resolution when you don't want to, let's say, absolve someone completely and you actually don't have time for certain processes that might be a little more obvious with that, right? And you're hurting, and you have a lot of people who rely on you because maybe a bunch of people that you know don't have jobs or the capacity to work, but you do, and to me, these are just regular everyday problems that normal people, not just like literary establishment people who, were like reading adult novels when they were 10 or something like that, are dealing with. And I just really wanted to stick with that version of trouble. And the emergency department is a great place to think like and about that. In part because you have all these people of different class positions who are doing like forced intermingling. And you also have um, this this different set of needs that you have to compare to each other and triage all the time. So what does it look like? The fact that you have all these people with chronic ailments, you have people suffering all different kinds of physical trauma, emotional, psychological traumas, and you also have this kind of circle, this loop that happens, especially in places like Philadelphia, where so many of the people that you'll meet there have some involvement with the military, and folks are also cycling through the nearby prisons, going into the hospital and then going back to prison. And I'm like, and to my mind, like this is the perfect setting to ask these kinds of questions without just doing the thing. Well, now we suddenly have a pause in time where everybody is working on collectively solving a problem. I'm like, everybody's at work, actually. Everybody's at work or they're sick or dying. Like those are the people that I know. I do not have that kind of intimacy with these other. I wonder where they are. I imagine they have lived very different kind of lives and sometimes have, for example, like healthy family members who can participate in their kind of world building. But most people I know are just not like that. And I want to try and build that form of kind of representation.
Yeah, I really appreciated that all their stories were here. They were, I think, individuals who you might have seen in passing in a different novel, and they were all up in here. You know what I mean? Like, this would have been like, oh, that one character in that one hospital room. Instead,
Hmm.
there's 25 of them. You know what I mean?
Right,
And
right,
every nurse is hustling, and no one has time to eat the jambalaya. Like, it is just everyone is hustling. And I because I read these two books in pretty close succession, I read the memoir first and then the novel second. There was a call back, a kind of call and response actually between the two. I know they're different genres, but because they're coming from your own experience, I could envision the child in the memoir growing up to have a job in the hospital, a child who is a victim of a lot of pain and suffering, growing up and sweetly and naively thinking, I shall work in hospital and I
right.
will fix the pain and heal the suffering, right? There's actually something beautiful about that. And the temptation, I think, in a novel might have been to like go through some suffering and then look at all these happy endings. And there was
Oh,
something
I
rough
can't
along
stand
the
that.
way. But there was nothing treacly about this. If anything, there was just sort of this like this grind, right? This nasty maggot filled wound is not going to get better. The lady who comes to the ER week after week after week in her own filth that is not going to get better. But doesn't mean there isn't healing, right? There doesn't mean there isn't
Right.
dignity. Some of my favorite scenes, and this will sound bananas, but some of my favorite scenes were when the nurse Joe is just tenderly cleaning someone's body, right? Taking care of the poop or the pee or whatever has come out, not just the blood, but just laying on of hands and knowing that this is not going to fix the overall problem with this person's health, but I can make it so that they are cleaned up and they're not on soiled bedding, and I'm going to give them a muffin. There was some
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful work in those scenes in particular.
I mean, it doesn't sound bananas because those are some of my favorite scenes too, and some of my favorite ones to write. And it's like one of those places where you can have that recognition, right? The kind of broader structural one, like, hey, I'm actually not able to fix this problem, but I can provide some kind of what might feel like soothing, what might to that person feel like love or care, and that's pleasurable in and of itself. Like, it doesn't have to be, I'm interested in this fact, like you don't have to, let's say, in a broadly fantastical way, transform the world by yourself as an individual person or something like that, right? But if you can provide those little bits of help to people who have less power than you, when you're in a position to do so, and especially this is especially true, I think, now without expecting, like a grand reward for it every time you do so or something like that. I think that that's good. I think that that's fundamentally a way that you can think about living your life. And I think that, yes, we would all be better off if we could just do that as much as possible. Um, Instead of pausing for like 3 hours to be like, did you know I clean this person? Like that's what mostly feels like is happening. I'm like, you don't have to do that. You can just do the thing that is better for the person who has less power than you. That doesn't require you to sacrifice your whole life. And you could do that all the time in many different ways for different people, and that will be fine. That would be great, even. And that's a lot of what I'm interested in trying to write about the everyday or everyday problems. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I found that beautiful. And I suppose we should at least help folks with the title in case they're not familiar. Why should the Lord's blessings rain down on Otis Spunkmeyer?
I mean, it's so the title is, it's from so kind of riff on Kurt Vonnegut. Um, and who, with regards to tone, I was always really interested in, especially because it has this really bleak, and also Vonnegut wrote about money in a way that I think a lot of people do not write about, or kind of refuse to, or write about money and power in ways that I thought were interesting. Uh, and had a tone that was like on one end humorous and deeply serious and humane. Um, the kind of these Otis Spunkmeyer muffins that just appear in these institutions like the hospital, like the military, like the prison. And on one end, they're a kind of symbol for this like short-term satisfaction that happens, these like kind of little tiny micro satisfactions that occur. And also a symbol of like what's left in the food desert, or like what can we feed people who we don't really care about feeding anything serious, right? This kind of like pre-packaged garbage, for lack of a better word. Not garbage in the sense that these are the worst things that you could possibly eat ever under any circumstances. There are many, many things, but they're the symbol I chose based on where and how they show up, right? And for a lot of people, it makes sense that folks, characters in the novel are searching for that thing that, like, if I could only feel a little better for 2 seconds, I might be able to take another couple steps forward, right? Given everything that's happening to those one cares about, and to yourself sometimes, and what does that look like, right? What does it look like to constantly take sustenance from this thing that is ultimately kind of bad? Like living in a faux democracy in general, right, is like one of these things that makes you be like, oh, I'm in some ways benefiting from this thing that is in pretty much every way horrible. Working at a university, we can go on and on about the kinds of things that are like that. And the muffin was just like a kind of funny example of that problem, I think.
No, it worked too, because no one in the novel was eating a lean protein and three vegetable sides. Like, no one
Right,
had
right,
a plate
exactly.
of food. No one was being truly nourished day after day, not just by food, but by the experience of their lives. No one was living that. And yet, at the same time, you had this momentary bliss. Well, I can help you out. Here's a plastic covered muffin, and
Hmm.
it's not the best, it's not the worst, it's what I have, and
Yeah.
I'll share it with you. But it tracks through. I mean, it goes it goes with the main character in the desert, right? The muffin was in Iraq. The muffin like the muffins traveled. That they worked as a symbol, I think, of the not futility so much as just the not enoughness that so much of us in
Yeah.
our situations have.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, those like, if you get some chocolate ones, and you refrigerate them for a little while, like to this very day, I'm like, damn, this is actually very good. And so, no reason to deny it, right? Like we're in a situation in which much of what we ingest, and this is especially at the level of food, right? There's very few things that you can eat in an American diet if you don't have a lot of time that are not kind of killing you anyway, right? Like I don't, I'm sure like sometimes nutritionists can seem hyperbolic with this, but they're not really that hyperbolic when they say things, right? Like when people complain about microplastics, they're not being insane, right? They're kind of just being honest. And if only we would admit that microplastics are a good symbol for just the way that we're forced to live, we might have a better starting place. Rather than the search for like absolute purity that it still seems to me is our primary like kind of pop cultural version of this discourse.
Yeah. That's interesting. Although now that we're talking about food and emptiness, I'm realizing I didn't. We need to at least talk about pets before we go here.
Oh.
So, like, I know I'm circling back to the memoir, but come on, growing up, your family barely had enough food to feed y'all most days, right? Like, they were just that's it came and it went. The kid in the memoir was often hungry, and yet you yourself had countless fish and
Hmm.
snakes and a guinea pig and a dog and an alligator. And every last one of them disappears or dies. What was all that about?
Yeah, it's funny. Every time I think about that, I'm like, maybe that was a form of me trying to practice care or what care looked like, right? Because they're these smaller, those are really minor satisfactions that you can have or small goods. It's like those people who think that, you're going to feed the wild animals. We know that ultimately, long term, this is a horrible thing, right? I would love to go and feed some fucking bears, right? But I know I'm not supposed to do that. And for reasons that are obvious, I'm not going to do it. Now, when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, was I did I have that level of absolutely not. I was like, this is a good thing for me to do. It will be so nice if I can like provide this animal with a home, which is a cage in my house. Strangely, right? Like that kind of logic. That like really old school, just horrible like imperial logic that you could be the shepherd primarily of changing an entire species habitat, right? And life and saying like I am good after that, right? It's so insane to think something like that. But alas, right, that was a good feeling that I could produce when I was a kid. And it took a long time after all those losses for me to be like, oh, actually, this is kind of horrible, and maybe I need to stop doing this. Yeah, if we really went there, we could like go into what domestication means at all and whether people should have cats and dogs, etc. Right? Which the only pets that I do have are like the kind of these like long domesticated animals, right? Like I have dogs and chickens in my backyard, stuff like that. So yeah, and it's part of that. It's all part of that kind of larger problem.
Well, there was something so doubly heartbreaking and beautiful about little Joey in this book, a child who is desperate for care, right? A desperate to just be um, unequivocally loved for who he is, and he's trying to nurture a quail in the basement, right? Or care for an alligator that's growing too big for his
Hmm.
cage that he can't afford a second one, or even teaching himself entrepreneurism by selling snakes in the street. There was something
Hmm.
the metaphor of that. I mean, not unlike the muffins in the novel, but the idea that like if you are not if you're not carefully cared for all the time, how on earth are you going to carefully care for
Right.
and feed a pet? But an
Yeah.
alligator, eh? Wow.
Yeah, including the which I mean, I still really actually love alligators. Um, I think I like that you caught on that comparison between the novel and the memoir, right? It's like the novel, like I think, and sometimes humorously, sometimes difficulty is about that same thing. It's like, oh, I'm supposed to care for you in this way because you are my mother, I am your son. You are my father, I am your son, grandfather, whatever. Like these kind of pre-described family things, and they don't work. Like they don't always work, right? And for some of us, they have never worked, but we're still gonna just try it and fail it without ever admitting that they don't work, which I think is a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, we have a number of aspiring writers who listen to the show and they always want to know the same thing. So I do like to ask it. It's generally just to like, how do you write a book, man? And I know there's no one answer to that, but what's your process like? How'd you write these books?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not always sure about it. So the one thing that I will say is, you know, when I am writing, I try to think of the book as not being important to anyone except me. Nobody, because nobody's forcing you to do it, and most of the time, if one of your primary impetuses for writing it are what is X gonna think? It doesn't always work, right? And sometimes it becomes obvious and seems goofy to me, especially. Uh, but I do think of how can I write something that is in relation to a lot of other books that I both love and kind of dislike, that is doing something a little bit different, that lives in relation to those things, and think of it as kind of as striking a more minor note within what already exists, while not necessarily trying to mimic anything that already exists. And you know, process wise, like quite literally, I know I'm really in a project where I'm losing sleep over sentences in the project. And I am going to bed thinking about it. I'm waking up in the middle of the night being like, no, this sentence is better this way. I'm texting myself or making notes at 3, 4 in the morning about it. And I get up before the kids get up and I say, okay, I know what to do next. I know where to go next. And just letting it take over my psyche so entirely, that, that there's movement on it, that it can be better so that the book can be better, more careful, more intelligent, more whatever, funnier, and all these things than I could ever be as a person. And that's ultimately the goal.
All right, you make it sound excruciating, but possible. All you have to do, folks, is to lose lots of sleep, be haunted by your sentences, and you'll be fine. I love that.
Yeah, every single time I play it.
Hey, we always close with some this and that little lightning round questions. You ready for these?
Yeah.
All right, just pick one. Coffee or tea?
Coffee,
Mountains or beach?
beach,
Dogs or cats?
dogs.
Blackened salmon or dirty rice?
Oh, black and salmon.
The song Don't Speak by Gwen Stefani when she was in No Doubt, or the movie Tremors with Kevin Bacon?
Tremors.
Birds or snakes?
Snakes.
Easy Bake Oven or Pokemon Dragonite?
Oh, definitely Dragonite.
This one has three: werewolf, gargoyle, or bear.
Damn. Werewolf. Werewolf. That's another next novel.
I'm going to be on the lookout for the werewolves in your future writing. Are you an early bird or a night owl?
Definitely early bird.
Are you a risk taker or the person who always knows where the band-aids are?
Uh, that's hard, actually. Risk taker. Though I also, yeah, the band-aids are there.
Gotcha. This is a fill in the blank. If you weren't working as a writer slash professor slash dad, and you had maybe a little bit of magic, what would you like to be instead?
Ooh, magician, sorcerer style situation. If we're talking otherworldly scenario. Uh, Other than that, a physician, doctor. I would probably have stayed that route.
It's interesting because I think of those as very similar. So
Right,
a magician
yeah.
physician. Magician
Mhm.
Physician, that can also be your next memoir. What is something quirky that folks don't know about you? A like, a love, a pet peeve?
Mm. Oh wow, that's kind of difficult. You know, something quirky that people don't know. You know, I suffer from like talking too much shit all the time, so it's hard to know. I think. Hmm.
Well, you once
Hmm.
kept an alligator in your backyard.
That's
I don't know
true. That's
anyone else who
true.
did that.
But I guess because I feel like everyone knows because I well not like people not like a ton of people are reading this book. So I guess that counts. That counts like keeping the alligator. Um, keeping the alligator. I think that would be the move.
Yeah, I like
Mhm.
it. The pop culture question here. What's a movie that you can't not watch on an airplane, or it's just on, or a television show you've lost yourself in? Just what's something a pop culture that you
Mm.
like?
Attack on Titan, the
Ooh,
anime, which I think is still one of the best narratives ever. I'm gonna write about this at some point.
all right. I have not seen, but I'll have to ask my daughter. She's the anime person in the family.
Oh, she's
Um,
definitely seen it though.
okay. Last two. What's your favorite ice cream?
Ooh, pistachio.
All right. And last one. If we were to take a picture of you truly happy and doing something you love, what would we see?
Just kind of like um talking nonsense with my friends. I think that would be it.
Yeah. It's actually my favorite. It's just like, what'd you do yesterday? Nothing. Together with other people.
Uh-huh.
To do
Yeah.
nothing together. It's
Yeah.
so
We were
rare.
eating, we ate food and we were talking.
Did
So,
nothing together with people I like. Yeah, I love that. Joseph Earl Thomas, your writing has been called contemplative, hilarious, disorienting, tragic, and thoroughly daring. Thank you for living inside of your stories and for sharing them with all of us.
thank you for talking to me about them.
Well, I'm real grateful. Folks, Joseph Earl Thomas's debut memoir is Sink. His novel is God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer. I looked at the list. There are more books coming, and you can find them all at your local library or an indie shop near you. To everyone listening, we're wishing you love and light wherever the day takes you. Be good to yourself, be good to one another, and we'll see you again soon on this wild and precious journey.